My name is Sophia Dyack, and on behalf of the Center for Urban History, I welcome you at this discussion. This is another conversation at our two-week lecture and discussion program of the DonKult forum. But this is also the format that we practice here at the Center, these conversations with historians and between historians. Today we will talk about the fluidity of borders and the change of borders, the shifting of borders, and how one writes about that. What is the role of the historian and of history in the time and before and prior to conflicts? In the 20th century, which was marked by radical visions and projects and changes, few things were as stable and constant as the revision and struggle for borders. The change of borders had to do with the change of empires, the colonial systems, and this formation of new states and societies. We can talk about, we can say that frequently with the change of borders through war and conflict, territory was gained or lost. This touched on the lives of many people. This was very dramatic, and again, dramatic and frequently murderous experience for many of those who experienced these things, and later for their descendants. So-called population transfers, ethnic cleansing, often accompanied the attempts to change borders. However, these internal borders also arose that had nothing, that were not reflected in the political map, but were just as palpable within the societies marked by these changes, frequently provoked by expected or extant changes and conflicts. The resettling and affected the ideas of these changes and personal biographies. The trauma, the overcoming of hostility, the possibility for dialogue and mutual understanding are only some of the subjects that have to do with the long-term attempts at understanding and conceptualizing the changes of borders. Our conversation today is not so much about what borders are and what the shifts in borders mean, but on how historians write these changes at various stages, whether in expecting these changes during the process and later, decades later, and also who this is done for and what this tells us about what their roles and the role of the past in society may be. Today we have the extraordinary opportunity to speak to three historians who study the 20th century in Ukraine, in Europe and Asia. I am particularly pleased to present today Professor Olena Styažkina. For those of us who were present at our previous lecture, here you have the opportunity to, you have already heard this. She's a historian, a writer and publicist. She teaches at the Donetsk National University. She is deputy editor of the New Pages of the Donbass periodical. She's a member of the Women Historians and Oral History Association of Ukraine. In 2013, she published a book on the person in the Soviet province accepting rejection. She now lives in Kyiv and works at the Donetsk University that has been moved to Vinnytsia as a result of the conflict. Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya has also been presented here several times as part of the DonKult. He was born and educated in Japan, eventually moved to the United States, where he continued his and wrote a dissertation at Princeton. In 1998, his publication on freedom and terror in the Donbass was published, the Ukrainian-Russian borderland, 1870s and 1990s. His seminal work. This book was translated into Ukrainian, is almost unavailable, perhaps only in libraries, but perhaps it will be published again. Later, he has done new studies and written new books that are not available in Ukrainian, but are available at our library, and you're very welcome to make use of them. It's The Voices of the Dead, Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s, and Conscience on Trial, the fate of 14 pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine, in 1952-53. Professor Kuromiya currently teaches history at the University of Indiana at Bloomington and works in Eurasian and international history in the 20th century. This is his first time at the DonKult, but not his first time at the Center for Urban History. Professor Serhiy Yekelchyk, and who first studied at the Kyiv State University and later defended a dissertation at the Academy of Sciences, Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and then again at the University of Alberta, and recently has been teaching in Canada at the University of Victoria. He teaches a course on the history of modern Ukraine, a history of Russia, history of Russian culture and Stalinism. He wrote a book on the Empire of Memory, Ukrainian-Russian relations in the historical imagination. This book is available in English and also in Ukrainian. Recently, he published a book, Comrade Stalin, Citizen Stalin, Everyday Politics, Policy Before the Terror, and very recently it came out, nobody even has a copy yet, this very fresh publication, a book on the conflict in Ukraine, is part of the Oxford University What Everyone Needs to Know series. His current project, his current study, has to do with the revolutions and civil wars before and during the First World War in the territory of Ukraine. After these brief presentations, we can see that our guests are not only scholars and students of, but also people who have who have personally experienced the changes that have to do with forced resettlement, repopulation, transfer. Perhaps it would be possible to include this personal dimension into our conversation, but first of all, I'd like to propose that the first part of the conversation we focus on Ukraine, on the 20th century, and perhaps and discuss the fluidity of borders, the change in borders, and the writing of history in the 20th century, especially if we look at how the changes in state borders, expected, contested, achieved and failed and thwarted, affect the formation of these internal boundaries. I give the floor first to Professor Yekelchyk, and if you, as you're working on your most recent research project of revolutions and civil wars, how did this series of conflict, this long-term series of conflict, how was it described at the time by historians? Or how did it change right after, right down the conceptualization and reconceptualization in the recent decades, and especially in the considering the century of the Great War, and also in to what extent it changed due to the in relation to the current history of Ukraine. Thank you, Sophia. I would like to start with a recent trip to Atlanta, where I had the pleasure to speak at a round table with a renowned American political scientist who wrote a book on Russian policy, that has now been republished 7 times, and he also spoke of the so-called Ukraine crisis. He showed the maps of electoral preferences during the last election, and he said this is quite obvious that the conflict in Ukraine had to happen if we look at how Ukraine voted in this year, and this year, and this year, to which of course I said, look, I'm very happy to be in the American South, which, according to the maps of the electoral preferences of the US, for many years and decades and possibly centuries, should also have a conflict here and should really be a separate country. So this, of course, is just a hint, an innuendo, saying that there's this great state understanding of how things are supposed to happen in certain ends of the world, but not here. But also a small lesson, object lesson in thinking back from a conflict always leads to obvious conclusions. Whereas if a conflict doesn't happen, then this obvious character is lost. And obviously, these disruptions, these processes, in cultural boundaries and state boundaries, are not something that has to happen. Are not things that cause the conflict. Something else causes the conflict. This is the first thing. And the second point of departure that I would like to start with is that we as historians have to really understand, and by the way, American political scientists also have to understand, that the moment we delve into this discourse of disruption, we affirm the discourse and even practice it and create it and legalize it. And especially we as historians who form the historical narratives of various regions of Ukraine as a nation, as a state, with certain boundaries, we have to always be critically clear of our position, of how the current political milieu affects us and our personal political preference affects us, and we have to understand that we participate in this process. Mikhail Serhievich Hrushevsky, back in the day, gave us a good example in that during the Ukrainian Revolution he started writing articles on what sort of Ukraine do we want at the threshold of a new Ukraine. So talking about the Ukrainian past and present, he was delineating, openly delineating the sort of ideal of Ukraine that he wanted to see. And by the way, this is very remarkable, without going too far into the topic, to understand that in those articles by Hrushevsky, the modern eye will notice a stress on civilian nationalism, on the rights of minorities in the future Ukraine, and on the fact that the relationships between the titular nations to the chief minorities will really determine the democratic character and the democratic future of the Ukrainian state. And so the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian National Republic, the Hetmanat, and the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet or Soviet Socialist Republic that followed them had very clear boundaries that were defined during the talks at Brest-Litovsk. And this, by the way, this issue relied on the arguments of the Ukrainian delegation. So it was basically discussed between the Germans and the Soviet-Russian delegation, but there were also arguments from the Ukrainian side. And this is how this ethnographic map of Ukraine arose without Crimea, that was later put at the basis of the boundaries of Ukraine, eventually of modern Ukraine. They were essentially determined largely in Brest, and they were determined by the Ukrainian patriots of the early 20th century, which again relied on this experience of this ethnographic populist study of folklore expeditions of the 19th century. But what the content of this state would be, as delineated by those interesting ethnographic boundaries, was a completely different question. It's not for nothing that I started with Hrushevsky, in the sense that he, of course, understood this. He understood the needs, because there was right next was a great state, it was Russia, and of course he had to determine the roles of the minorities and the roles of regions in such a way as to put Ukraine firmly on the map. But also I think this was his principled democratic approach that was intrinsic, I think, that was very characteristic of the Ukrainian movement in the early 20th century. However, this beginning of my comment on the American South, of course, forced me to think, if we look at the electoral preferences, then of course they'd have to have war and separate states, but they did have war. And 600,000 people did die in the U.S. Civil War. So we could look at this cultural disruption, this political disruption, and of course they vote differently, as a sort of foreshadowing of war, but we can also see it as an unhealed wound of war that has already happened. And of course, if you look at the world press, you know how loud it is in America, how big the news right now is. Then South Carolina will not lower the Confederate flag in spite of the mass shooting, mass murder in the state recently. And of course the person says, yes, I'm a racist and I did this because I'm a racist. All of this was recorded, and the flag, the Confederate flag, that carries all of the heritage of the white racism, the provincial legislature the state legislature didn't even fly it at half-mast. So this question remains, and I think the question is not just how the borders are delineated, but also with what content you fill those boundaries, and also how the wounds of the wars that have already happened or are now happening heal. And I think that the great country, the United States, is not really an example of a well-healed boundary and division of war. That boundary between the Confederates and the North is quite noticeable. At the same time, the Canadian-American border, by the way, I live in a city that geographically should belong to the US, but since it's on an island, that they decided not to divide the island. So right across the water are Americans. You could swim across. I mean, the water is cold, but you could swim across. Of course, this boundary was also established in animosity. There was the War of 1812 when the Canadian troops burnt Washington and the capital. Right. This was a heroic event of the Canadian history. However, now, of course, there's a different interpretation. It's the friendship, it's the fraternal boundaries, economic cooperation. Nobody's writing about the heroism of the Canadian soldiers that burned Washington to the ground and the capital to the ground in 1812. So this is an example of a trauma, of historical trauma that has healed reasonably well. Although Canada had, for a long time, had this complex of the younger sibling, and at the same time the heroic narrative of trumping America. In Ukrainian history, I can talk very long. Yeah, I know. That's why maybe we should come back to the history of Ukraine and to the examples that maybe we'll come back to the examples that you've pointed to in the second part of our discussion when we look beyond Ukraine. But thank you for bringing these notes in already into the discussion. The next chronological, this period, the period of the First World War and the Civil War, and also the Ukrainian Revolution, and to turn to Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya, I would like us to go, further decades, maybe like 2 decades ahead, the Second World War, the end of the 1930s, and the formation of the western border of Ukraine and the Ukrainian-Polish borderland. So the topic that is complicated, much has been written on it and said, especially in this city, obviously. This is important, salient, but what happened then? What was the role of history and historians then in delineating the history of the border of Western Ukraine and forming Western Ukraine in place of the regions of the Lviv, Stanislavov, and Tarnopol, and this example?
I'm going to speak English, so maybe some of you need this. We do know that there was no administrative unit called Ukraine in Imperial Russia. So in fact, the Ukrainian state border starts with 1918, and there are turmoil and so on. And the end result of 1921 was not always very satisfactory, but especially in the West, because of the Soviet-Polish War, which led to the loss of a large chunk of western part of Ukraine. However, there is an important development taking place in the 1920s in Poland, which is the so-called Prometheism, which assumed that the independence of Ukraine would be the beneficial to the cause of independence of Poland. Now, whether they would support the old Curzon line that had been proposed or something different, it's not entirely clear to me, but at least sort of, within the Poland, that sort of political movement for the support of Ukraine emerged, and that was a great improvement for the cause of Ukraine, which we should not ignore. And there are other experiments like Bologna experiments of Henryk Józefski, about which Professor Timothy Snyder has even written a book, which I think was translated into Ukrainian, maybe not, maybe just into Polish. So, despite the Ukrainian-Polish conflict, there was a great deal of changes taking place in the 1920s and 1930s. But of course, we do know what happened to the ethnic Poles in this country. Borders also meant the question of borders also meant identity and loyalty. And therefore, as I discussed yesterday, ethnic Poles in Ukraine fared extremely badly, or for that matter in Belarus as well. In addition, many of those ethnic groups whose motherlands were borderland of the Soviet Union, such as Estonia, Latvia, and so on, these people were, of course, regarded as enemy nations and suffered a great deal. Then what happens? Well, Hitler and Stalin collaborated and decided to destroy Poland, which in a sense benefited Ukraine. This is a bit of an irony of history. And then what happens? Well, in 1941, Hitler broke an agreement with Stalin and attacked the Soviet Union. This is nothing new to you, to most of you. But then, of course, there was a sort of unwritten, sort of implicit agreement between Stalin and Polish leaders that they would respect the old Curzon line, which would include West Galicia into Poland. Stalin made never explicit agreement, but Stalin hinted that he would accept it, just because he wanted the support of Poland in order to fight Nazi Germany. Well, in the end, what happened is that before the Germans were kicked out, before the Red Army came in, of course, we all know that Ukrainians and Poles started killing each other, particularly in Kuromiya, but to some extent here in Galicia too. And that was, of course, an extremely brutal event. Nothing, what's happening today in the East is not really comparable. Despite all these, killings, in the end, of course, Stalin sort of enforces the inclusion of Eastern Galicia, Western Belarus into the Soviet Union, into Soviet Ukraine, into Soviet Belarus, and of course, because of this, Ukraine benefited enormously. This is nothing new. What to make of it? Well, it's very difficult, but I think what we need to understand here is we have to take this issue seriously. These border changes, the reason for the border changes, the costs of the border changes, and the subsequent development of this question. Now, nothing has changed since then. The borders have been kept. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the borders were kept. Poland accepted it. How did it happen after so many people were killed on both sides? And here, I think there was a tradition of the Prometheism movement that certainly helped, but at the same time, I also have to say that because we're talking about intellectuals, the contributions played a very important role, and that is the group of Yekelchyk, who emigrated after the war, created and published this journal called Kulturno, in which, against the sentiments of the majority of Poles, kept insisting that, sure, we lost Lviv, Galicia, we fought, we couldn't get it. Stalin said, Lviv is so important to Ukrainians. And Poles said, of course Lviv is so important to Poles. And the Poles said, well, you have Ukraine, you have Kiev. And then Stalin says, well, you have Krakow. And so that's so incredible sort of discussion taking place between Єkelchyk and Stalin. But since I think early 1950s onward, until 1989-91, there was sort of intellectual impact, sincere intellectual effort made from outside Poland onto the Polish society, that for all what that happened between Ukraine and the Poles, probably we should accept this border settlement. It must have been very, very difficult for the Poles, but they accepted, and that's why we are peaceful now. Now, if Ukraine do the same thing, if some parts, say maybe Hungarians in say Transcarpathia wants to separate from Ukraine, what are we going to do? What do Ukrainians want to do? There are these questions. Nevertheless, I think that kind of lesson we should take as a country. It's not that we do worse than the Poles, but we need to understand that history and look forward to the future in terms of border issues with other countries and in terms of Ukraine's future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this second recount of our past within the changing borders. And chronologically, we will shift to the late 80s, early 90s. Because basically the appearance of the eastern border of Ukraine as a state border, did it appear, did it emerge or not, and what meaning does it have for contemporary Ukraine? It was experience that Professor Styažkina embraced as a historian, as a resident of this region, the early 90s. As a researcher and as a teacher, she was also a direct participant of that process. What was the rhetoric? What were the linguistic means? And how did people try to contemplate on the articulation of change or absence of change or potential change of the eastern border of Ukraine? Thank you very much. Okay, Brown, there's a book, the biography of a non-existent place. And to some extent, we can be talking about the eastern border and about the Donetsk region and the Luhansk region as a place that does not really exist. That does not exist on a specific mental map, in whose mental map does it not exist. We can agree with Franz Boas and the followers and founders of his school on the fact that in different societies, or rather in the same society, people reside and live in different chronological orders. By that, it is meant that one part of society professes and organizes modern practices, and the other part of the society lives in a full-fledged traditional world or in a full-fledged archaic world and professes the values of this archaic world. So when we are talking about the eastern border, the question of for whom this eastern border exists and has always existed, and for whom this border has never existed and does not exist and should not exist even in the future, needs to be answered. If we have a look at the social anthropology of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, we will understand that there was not any border there since the 18th century, or maybe even earlier. There was no border there, just the wild field. Where did it start? Where did it end? And what was the border? Or what were the boundaries? It was not clear for people of the archaic society, because for those people, the borders were about occupied lands and about towers. The 20th century changed everything. After the developments of the Civil War, even for elites of those regions, little changed. For example, in the business documentation of the executive party committees, it was written, the press came from, and then the list, Kharkiv, Moscow, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Moscow, Kyiv. So the hierarchy of space, the importance of space, capitals, other regions that were important. Everything depends on the origin of land, the origins of species, the fight of classes, the history of Russia, and then the history of the Donbass. So that was the priority list. But at the same time, the party committees referred the developments in Moscow to the chapter state of affairs.
International state of affairs.
So basically, which means nowhere. And for other residents, it was clearly associated with Ukraine because it was about the language, traditions, national clothes, national cuisine. So there were no open questions there. But at the same time, people did not really wonder where the border was. They knew that the border was where they were living, but they didn't really care what was happening beyond the territories where they lived. And the history that was taking place in these lands was about this permanent geographical shifting. Taganrog was part of the Donetsk province and then was excluded from it. Pavlograd is part of the Donbass from an economic point of view, but it also sort of part of the Dnipropetrovsk region. So the geography was shifting all the time. Where were the borders? It was not clear. And now we can observe, not really now, but in 1991, when officially the borders between Ukraine and Russia were established, the question emerged, for whom and by whom, and the answer was for Europe, for the modern society, for people that profess the values of modern society. So that was the border for modern people, for modern societies. But it was not a border for archaic society, a society with archaic diseases and inflictions and some archaic instincts. There was no border because the border was where we installed the tower. So I think that the logic of this non-existing eastern border was transmitted by the Russian Federation from the very beginning of the determination of this official border. So basically, Russia has been preparing for this attack that we are experiencing right now. And when we hear from the Russian propaganda that Ukrainians exist, but there is no Ukrainian state as such, this statement is not addressed to Kyiv and Lviv. This statement, this premise is addressed to these lands where there are Ukrainians. We cannot deny this fact, and Russia cannot deny this fact. There are Ukrainians even in the eastern part of Ukraine, but there's no Ukrainian state there. And this part of the archaic society or the archaic elements in our traditional society, I would even call it industrial archaism or industrial pagancy or some sort of hybrid or archaism. So these archaic elements are willing to perceive this statement that there is no border there and this border has never existed there.
So when we look into whether or not this boundary exists, we see several possible optics here, several possible viewpoints from which we will look through. Obviously, the boundary is there. Obviously, the border is there. Obviously, it was internalized, processed, including by the local elites, because it was in their interests and it was very good for them. From the point of view of Moscow, there is no border, never has been, and there shouldn't be one, and that's what we transmit. And also from the point of view of certain people, certain individuals, there is the agreement that there's the consent that there is no boundary, and from the point of view of many people, this boundary exists. So we have different views, starting from 1991, at the existence of this border. And so when we enter the discussions of the process of this border, of this boundary, I have a sense that we still we still enter the space controlled by Moscow. We perform a certain doctrinal position, discussion, and if we're discussing something, then we're not sure. Then we're not sure that it exists. But it exists. And there's no discussion, really. And so if somebody is a sweet, lovely maniac and lives in an archaic space and they think that they've conquered Rome, they can think what they like. But the boundary exists. Of course, the eastern border, for people who live at the border, is something somewhat unsure. But this same situation of a relatively unsure border exists everywhere where the boundary exists between, let's say, between the United States and Mexico, or between Ukraine and Poland. These connections, these links, these trans-border movement exists the same everywhere, and it's nothing unique. And to use this to build a concept of a non-existent border, that's impossible. I'll just use this example so that we understand what we're talking about. That the boundary has emerged, and it exists, and it should exist, and it will continue to exist. With my colleagues from our department, we've looked at our international academic connections, and it turned out that our academic links with the Russian colleagues aren't even within the top 5 countries. Russia isn't even within the top 5 countries. Our number 1 country in terms of international links is Poland. This is in Donetsk. Poland is number 1. And this is a very interesting fact, very notable fact. It's not that we have, already fought and we're already enemies, but the fact that this boundary exists, and it's just as real as the boundary with Poland, or the boundary with between the US and Canada, etc., etc. That's sort of the idea. Thank you. I would like us to maybe, first of all, broaden the focus to a more global, to other examples. And in these other examples, we have these 2 or 3 aspects that I would like you to touch on as you like, and kind of bring the historians into this discussion with their varying roles. What can their different roles be between, engagement to legitimacy, lending legitimacy from describing the boundary as Serhiy described, to publishing books like the Overcoming of Historical Justice, and to the various hybrid stages in between, the different commissions and dialogues and committees, joint committees that work together. That also change and show the different prospects or different perspectives of what the regional, the national, and the transnational and global history is. On the other hand, maybe if we could bring in this concept of conflict, because very often history is about conflict. Conflict creates traces, it creates documentation. Conflict not just as war, but conflict as trial and lawsuits, and this is the bread and butter of history. This is what gives us materials. But on the other hand, if we look at the social role of the historian and the history, and the use and the delineation, description of the situation as a conflict, what does it? What sort of responsibility flows from that? Follows from that? How is it understood? And what is the language? What is the discourse? So on the one hand, I invite us to talk about perhaps other examples and leave, the boundaries of Ukraine and even Europe, and on the other hand, focus on the situation and the use of all of these concepts such as conflict and post-conflict, and the role of historians in this situation. Serhiy, you will stop me, right? Yeah, I will stop you. 4 minutes, and I will just try and stop people. All right. Well, of course, we should come back to the concept of empire, which has not yet been at the center of our discussion, but which has to appear, if only because the gubernias that were brought together were old Tsarist gubernias. It was only the Bolsheviks in the 1920s were looking at the Povets and shifting the different Povets between both Belarus or Russia. So of course this is also the imperial legacy that has not been processed, has not been reconceptualized, rethought, because the Soviet Union gathered many lands of the empire. And so this legacy of the so-called commonality, so-called friendship, fraternity of nations, which is an ideology that arises in the 1930s when the Stalin regime goes back to a cultural conservatism, outlawing abortions, outlawing homosexualism, and renewing the cult of Tsarist generals. That's when this fraternal nations and friendship of nations arises. This is a new kind of, obviously this is the Russian Empire, but this is a new proletarian understanding of this empire. So obviously 1991 became this very remote echo of the sense, of the understanding that had to follow but did not follow then. And so, of course, the nature of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government in the 1990s was not really conducive, as well as the economic climate together with the oligarchs and the development of the oligarchs in the late 90s, because of a certain commonality of the objective economic interests between the oligarchs of those two countries and the methods of building this kind of liberal democratic state in name, but oligarchic in essence. And so the borders in this case acquired new roles, the roles of, they had to have some kind of symbolic, statist significance, but please no tariffs, because the trade is the most important, and of course we're reaping the results of this. Another category that is important to understand is to mention with regard to this is violence, because of course it is the empire that creates this violence, and the collapse of empires also includes violence. And we can talk of the committees of reconciliation that work best, I think, in those cases where we're talking about more or less equal partners in a new society, in a new community, who understand that they're building the same one common home of Europe. When we have a country that has not experienced the rejection of its imperial past and a former part of this empire, then, these are not equal partnership dialogue. So now, what happened, the violence that was perpetrated in a certain model that I've already described as ethnographic and populist. And so, of course, from that time we have this kind of chopped off ends, unfinished work, and certain patriots keep saying that we have to bring it back. Like Kuban should have been Ukrainian if we look at the census of such and such year. But if we look at a different census, it didn't have to be Ukrainian. So, had we done that, it would have been part of Ukraine. But now maybe it's no longer part of Ukraine. Or let's say Holmstina, Helm region. You know that Khrushchev's third wife, she was from the Helm region. She was evacuated during the First World War, and they were collecting signatures to bring Holmstina into Ukraine, and if they had gotten enough inscriptions, as Professor Kuromiya had said, if Stalin had made agreements with the allies, with Zakarzonia, with Transkarzonia, then this narrative, this national ethnographic narrative would have justified it. Now that there has been violence from either part of the border, from both Poles and Ukraine, to create a homogenic national community, this won't work. Also, I remember the atlas by Professor Magocsi of the Ruthenians, and they look at the census of 1910 or 1920. Why specifically that census, not all others following subsequent or previous censuses? Because that particular census says that was supposed to be Rusin land. So what is common in all these projects, with all these lacking limbs and these lacking tails, is the understanding that they have to understand a nation as a living organism. And this is the same understanding that the pro-Russian forces now rely on in arguing that they are a Russian-speaking, Russian cultural community. And because it is And because the principle of forming of statehood is an ethnic and cultural principle, then this community has the right to exist. Whereas in reality, if we look at this question, again, this is the argument of the book, of my new book that nobody's ever seen yet. I haven't seen it yet. It comes out on August 3rd. But it's very instructive to look at the Poles and the attitudes to Stalin, the attitudes to the Soviet past, the same monuments are very instructive. We're talking about a political model. So people at the front line can say on the one part and on the other one, they can speak Russian or they can speak Surjik, a mixture. But we know that the political model is very different. And so it follows that the real content of this boundary, the real essence, the real construction of a state that people would like to live in is not ethnic. We've inherited this ethnic principle, but really it should be political and democratic in building a state that would be attractive for everybody in it. And I would like to believe that this is what M. Hrushevsky meant in his articles of 1917. I would like to give the floor to Professor Kuromiya.
I forgot to mention that yes, things didn't on the western border, and things didn't end with the Bolinian massacre. We didn't know that there was a special operation called Operacja Sejm between 1944 and 6, in which Soviet police went after Polish underground. And then, of course, most famously, in 1947, Operacja Wisla or Stura in Poland to deport those ethnic Ukrainians who ended up on the other side of the border to be deported to the northwestern lands of Poland. So, yes, I agree with Professor Yekelchyk that it's not ethnicity that defines the nation, and other things. It's sort of people who live within the border, whatever their nationality may be. Now, as far as our task is concerned, well, I cannot be too arrogant and say that we are so important. Nevertheless, if we look at history, and I already mentioned the Polish intellectual role, in the role they played on the reconciliation, or the efforts of reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine, I think they played an extremely important role, far more important role than the politicians. Now, in terms of Russian-Ukrainian relations, Russian-Ukrainian reconciliations, what can we do? Or maybe in my case, I'm a foreigner, I have no stakes, family or any, in Ukraine or Russia, so I think I can be a little more objective in that sense. I think what matters is, from my point of view, is be open. For example, this effort I mentioned between Ukraine and Poland, they basically, Poland released all the secret documents, formally secret documents, and the Ukrainian SBU tried to do the same. And that, shed enormous light on the difficult issues between Poland and the Ukrainians. Now, we cannot expect that to happen now between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia is retrogressing in that sense. I'm interested in many foreign, sort of international history of Russia, not just in the West, but in the East. And it's just damn difficult. When there are some issues, the many documents that relate to Northern Caucasus, Donbas area, that these documents were withdrawn many years ago, actually, in Moscow. And then many documents that relate to other parts of the former Soviet Union, God, they don't show them. They just don't show them. They show you trash. The most important document they don't show you. They even don't show you what kind of documents they have. That kind of secret really prevents us from reaching any kind of a sort of mutual understanding, reconciliation. And from my point of view as a scholar, we really need to force them to be open We have all kinds of difficult problems. We all have, any country has their own difficult problems. But in order to overcome difficult problems, we need to be open. We should know what happened. We should know what the government did. We should know what each of us, our ancestors, did to us, to others. And from there we can move on. Without it, I think it's really very difficult. And in this particular case, yes, clearly Russia is more at fault. And I am happy to know that Ukrainian SBU says it will open everything. Wonderful. It's an incredibly good move on the part of the Ukrainian government.
Yeah.
I would like to emphasize one thing. I would like to talk more about the responsibility of historians while describing or recounting wars. Because I do believe that words play a colossal role in what has happened and is still happening on the territory of Ukraine. And in our case, in the case of Ukraine, the word conflict is not the word that we should be manipulating with or using. Regarding the responsibility of historians in the rethinking and describing of wars, there are some points that we need to keep in mind. Well, in our history textbooks, it's written that Assyria or Assyrian Empire reached the highest prosperity and conquered Urarta and some other territories. When we write for our children that the Greek Hellenistic state prospered in the times of Alexander Macedonian, basically we tell our children that the war is something good, that wars are about prosperity, get ready, and if necessary, then next time you can join this war. And this is something that we do ourselves. We sort of advocate for war, or we promote warfare, and we should not point fingers at others. When Europe expressed their attitude towards World War II by saying never again, they meant not only physical deaths, but they also meant that they didn't want to test their endurance anymore. So basically, we don't want to test once again whether I will stand the test, or maybe I will become a collaborator or a traitor. So never again is not about shootings and killings, but it's about not having to go through such trials once again in the future. So while describing a conflict, a military conflict, I'm talking about warfare right now, the task of a historian is to do everything possible to prevent war, to write more about the cost of war. And when we're talking about the responsibility of historians while describing warfare, my responsibility and my debt is that I have done little for the concept of occupation in the times of World War II was interpreted not through the eyes of Stalin, of a victim and hero, but through the eyes of a person that was part of that situation and whose behavior will not be determined by any strategy, because even the pure strategy of survival does not work here, because sooner or later people have to give their lives, because a heroic deed is basically nonsense from that point of view. But it's all about lack of strategy, lack of systemic character. The killer or the torturer in the morning can become a defender in the evening. And this is something that we still do not have. Somewhere deep inside our hearts, we are aware of the fact that it's not that easy. But in fact, it's even more complex than we can imagine. And the history of occupation is the responsibility that has not been fulfilled by historians. And as a consequence, we have a lot of expectations and anticipation of resistance, of a partisan fight. If someone is not part of the partisan movement, we call them traitors. And we forget that in the times of occupation, Ukrainians were very bad towards each other. But at the same time, it does not mean that if in 1941 they were not on good terms and they killed Jews and betrayed their neighbors, it does not mean that now they will not be willing to give their lives or sacrifice their lives for others. So I think that the responsibility of historians while describing warfare is to see a human being and to document why it's important to not have that situation again, why this never again statement is very important. I would like to continue this topic. I would like to support the words by Professor Styashkina that it would be a very democratic and Western experience of the description of warfare, focus on human beings, focus on rescuers and savers, that any heroic deeds during warfare is about calling not to have war anymore. And this is something that we need to draw from World War II. But the narratives that we are creating right now have some loaded words, and these words have different emotional loads in different languages. The word conflict has a different emotional load in our language than in the English language. Crisis is another word that we use. We don't want to use such words as occupation or aggression, the return of the previous power. We'd rather call it a crisis or a conflict. But I think that in this context, it's very important to highlight not the historical victories in Konotop battle, but it would be worth emphasizing a very interesting moment of the late 80s, early 90s, when in Kiev, the Republican Stadium, the current Olympic Stadium, was full to commemorate the death of Sakharov's death, because it was clear that the fight for the destruction of the authoritarian empire was a common fight, and the fight of the Ukrainian dissidents was the same fight that the Russian dissidents participated in. And the fact that this moment was lost is the responsibility on the shoulders of Russian ideologists, the Russian authorities, but Ukrainians as well, because our ways parted, and this is something that we do not highlight in our narratives. It's easier to describe our heroic victories over the Russians and for the Russians to do the same thing than to find these moments of lost democratic cooperation. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to our audience. I would like to encourage all the participants to ask their questions, make any comments. There are some microphones that we have. I can see that Tatiana wants to ask a question. Raise your hands if you have a question or want to make a comment. Tatiana, you're welcome. Thank you very much. While talking about responsibility, but I want to point out that I'm not a historian, but for many years I've been researching the Ukrainian-Russian border, and for 2 years there has not been a single day that I have not been thinking about that. If I knew how this whole situation would end, I would have approached a lot of I would have addressed a lot of the issues in a different way. But I want to compliment Olena Styashkina's comment, her first comment. I think that this non-existence of the border in the minds of certain people, or this mental incompletion or incomplete construction or establishment of this border is indeed a problem that we have been dealing with until now. But I would not really reduce it only to the Russian politics, even though it's true indeed that in the 1990s Russia was interested in open borders, and it was a means of control on their part. They wanted to control their area of influence, but at the same time we should keep in mind that the building of the Ukrainian state was taking place at the peak of the European integration processes. The discourse that dominated in Europe was the distance of disappearing borders. Europe was basically celebrating the disappearance of borders. And even when we're talking about the Ukrainian-Polish border, it was the discourse was about the disappearing borders. The border was treated as something archaic, as something obsolete. So from the point of view of Europe, borders are archaism, and from the point of view of postmodern Europe, we should have a world without any borders, without any boundaries. And it definitely had an impact on how it was contemplated upon in Ukraine, because in eastern Ukraine, the regional elites applied this discourse. Why should we build a wall between Ukraine and Russia? We have a lot of commonalities. We are bilingual. We are multicultural. So basically, they were trying to apply the European discourse. They borrowed this European discourse, and Putin himself said, whenever Ukraine was announcing its plans for EU integration or NATO membership, Putin would always say that we are against constructing new walls on the territory of Europe. And I think, this is my last sentence, in my opinion, Ukraine in this context experienced the same situation as during the Budapest Memorandum. Basically, we are hostage of this situation. So that was not a question, that was a comment. Mr. Leonid, you are welcome, because I saw that you raised your hand. Dear colleagues, very interesting issues that we are discussing right now. I have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, we will not have enough time to raise all of them. Just two questions. I would like to hear your brief comments. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to all the participating experts. When we're talking about historians, we need to remember one thing. Historians are not from Mars. They work in the current conditions, and they perform one important function. They identify and legitimate nations and historic topics. So historians cannot be neutral. Historians can advocate for certain values, but they always advocate for those communities that they select for themselves. It's a very important item, because we have this naive perception that historians can be neutral, which is not true. At least this is my opinion. Historians always opt for a specific community that they try to legitimize and identify. So this is the first question. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Now, a question related to borders. We've been talking about borders in abstract terms, because there are a lot of different borders: ethnic, mental, political. Today, we've been talking mostly about political borders, political boundaries, but the matter of the relations between mental and political borders is of great importance here, and I think this is something that we have not touched upon yet. Mrs. Styashkina talked about non-existing borders, but I think that mental borders and other borders do exist, not only between Ukraine and Russia, but also between Ukraine and the Donetsk region. As for ethnic borders, I want to remind you that before World War I, Ukrainian intellectuals that were quite few, and Yaroslav Gryzak wrote that they were so few that you could squeeze them into one train car. So these Ukrainian intellectuals were very few, but still they were preparing for the war. At that time, everyone was preparing for the war. And following the Ukrainians and Poles in Pridnipryavshchina, the Ukrainians were also preparing for the war. There was one book that indicated that the Ukrainians were preparing a map of Ukraine, and it was more of an ethnic or mental map. But I think that the historians present here are aware of this book. This book was published in Russia, in Moscow, that from Brest up till here, these were territories, ethnic territories that were occupied. And we have a look at this map at the end of the 20th century of the 1930s. The map is completely different. What was the 20th century about? And this is a question to all the participants. What was it for Ukraine, for the subject of international relations, for the subject of national development? What was the 20th century for Ukraine? What did it mean for Ukraine as a subject of national development? Why am I asking those questions? Because in Donetsk region, according to Bogdan Kravchenko, before the war, 60% of the population were Ukrainians. After the war, there were still a lot of Ukrainians, but only 52. So what happened to the other 8% of the Ukrainians? If we have a look at the south, what happened to all these Ukrainians? So it's a very important question from the point of view of what Serhiy Yekelchyk mentioned, from the point of view of the meaning of empire, imperial policy, colonization, etc. So I don't want to talk about Western borders because it should be a topic of a different discussions. But so I want to ask you about the meaning of the 20th century for Ukraine.
Thank you for the question. We have two, and I would like to perhaps speak, Olena, to speak on the commentary of Tatiana Zhuzhenko. Tatiana, thank you for your comment. Yes, it's all true, but you know, we do have these three historical dimensions between the archaic and the modern and the postmodern. It's a game at these different chronological time and tempi that is quite correctly used. And you're right, but you know, I was very struck by something else, and I'm sorry that I was struck, but I'm a traumatized person, so I'm allowed. You know, that there are borders between Donetsk region and Ukraine. Well, of course, but I know, and I see it now, that there's a cultural border between Kyiv and Kyiv. Between Kyiv that voted for the mayor, for Chernovetsky as mayor, and the Kyiv that came out to the Maidan. And I see that there's a cultural boundary and a mental boundary between Lviv and Lviv. Moreover, I see that there's a boundary between occupied Donetsk and the small towns in the Donetsk region for whom Donetsk is Rome, that you have to occupy barbarically and rape. And so if we talk about, you know, the specific borders between Donetsk and Ukraine and not see that they're just the same borders in every town and every region, then, you know, we can get very, very far. And you know, not to steal the microphone again. Well, where did all those Ukrainians disappear in the Donetsk region and the Luhansk region? Well, they rewrote. They re-identified, and we discussed this, of course, in the period that followed the war. To write yourself in as a Russian was more advantageous because it was a titular nation. Russia was the titular nation, and if anybody wanted a career or was considering, you know, have a child that has to make a career, of course, in a mixed marriages, you know, a Ukrainian woman or a Ukrainian man, and if the wedding was mixed between the Ukrainian and the Russian, then the question was resolved in favor of Russian identity. But I would like to mention, you know, those who were born Ukrainian, because, of course, I'm Russian ethnically, and of course a Russian speaker, and I feel Ukrainian. I identify as Ukrainian, and nobody will convince me otherwise. And my colleagues, I see that my colleagues and my friends are mostly Russians and Russian speakers today, and 10 years ago they identified as Ukrainians, and this has nothing to do with the census. So, what is the 20th century for Ukraine's subjectivity or being a subject of international politics? Well, I think the 20th century is the century when Ukraine was kind of feeling in the dark for a kind of subjectivity. It's very slow, perhaps not as poetic and beautiful as we'd like, but no one said that birth is not pretty. It's a bloody, messy thing, and yeah, we have much to be ashamed of, and we also have much to be proud of, and we have a positive thinking. The positive thinking in the context of the 20th century is not working here yet. And if we talk about the responsibility of the historian, we have to activate, engage this positive thinking in the 20th century that is now being described mostly as our losses. I think that there's much to see that is positive, including the formation of a political nation, the kind of quintessence of which was the Maidan protests, where it wasn't ethnicity, but political identity that became, that was at the center.
I agree. I think Ukrainian nation, these are constructs. There's nothing sort of written in the stone or something. It changes, things change, same concepts of ourselves, concepts of nations always change. So there's nothing that is static or defined in such fine details. People change, nations change. And in the case of the Donbass, after the independence of Ukraine, there is a clear sign that many ethnic Russians began to identify themselves as Ukrainians. There is absolutely nothing wrong. You are Canadian, yeah, you're born Ukrainian. I'm born in Japanese. I can always become American. I haven't chosen to do that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong. You can speak language with accent. You can speak Ukrainian with an accent. Absolutely nothing wrong. So what happened to Ukrainians? I think that seems to assume that there is something permanent, there is something idealized Ukrainians to which we should strive to, or to which we should adhere to. I think that seems to be wrong. I think, yes, Ukrainians, that always changes with influences from Kiev, from Lviv, from other parts of Ukraine. So it's a very dynamic process, and we cannot assume that there is something ideal there.
Subjectivity is a difficult matter, is a tricky beast, because we're talking about imaginary Ukraines that are embodied, that can be embodied or cannot be embodied. There is that Ukrainian National Republic, and then you have two projects. You have the project of the Ukrainian nationalists and the project of Soviet Ukraine. And we have inherited them both in an interesting way, and it's not so easy to reconcile them. And we have to understand that both projects also were projects of their time, of the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And objectively, they are somewhat similar, and sometimes the things that made them similar would not have been acceptable to us today in the 21st century. Both the Soviet partisans and the Ukrainian insurgents ran into Polish partisans and killed them for various reasons. For various visions of Ukraine, various visions of Poland. These facts exist, of course. So, but that hybrid project that we have inherited, really we have to fill it with new political and democratic essence, because while we recognize that in their way these people are patriots of Ukraine, and this is why there are so many debates of decommunization, I really think it's desovietization. It's this experience of a state socialism, of a Leninist, Stalinist kind of state socialism. It's a very specific experience that really could have, where Ukrainian patriots could have coexisted. There were quite a few Ukrainian patriots on the other side as well, in their way, and in which these Ukrainian patriots, such as Dovzhenko, for instance, who, comes out of the Red Army and sees himself as a liberator, although today we would say, so-called liberator, but Dovzhenko was part of it. We do not reject Dovzhenko. Dovzhenko is one of ours. So these different versions of Ukrainian identity, the different projects, none of which was fully actualized. So we have this hybrid option in which the Maidan, as Olena so rightly said, has invested with new meaning, a very correct meaning, a civil patriotism, kind of Western democratic model, in which I think Ukraine's future lies. There are 3 questions. There's one here, and then Professor Walkowicz and Professor Maranovich. My question is for historians. Could you please tell us, in what time would you say that the nation of Ukraine has lost its boundaries? Because the nation of Ukraine is, of course, the community, whether the regional, the smaller units, local, or Ukrainian. But in the constitution in '96, the people of Ukraine lost this right. So then finally the people, the nation as a legal person, as a legal entity that owns the land, it doesn't exist. There is no regional, there's no local. The regional councils can be called, you know, treasonous units, because they steal, they're corrupt. It's the state socialism that were taken from us, in addition to the territories from the Soviet Union that was taken with voting. And to continue today, following from the boundaries of Ukraine together, the question of the regions of every village, city, town, locality, and region. We have the reform, but there is no property for land. There's no local property of land. The courts are not a legal entity. The parliament is not a legal entity because it's not responsible for anything, but it votes. And so, historically speaking, perhaps in some time, this is a question that we discuss within the boundaries of Ukraine, perhaps these very same questions will arise after the reunification that is being suggested to us. Perhaps there will be smaller wars between the communities, and the consequences can be just as awful as they exist in the Donbass. The view of historians, are the people the masters of the land? Where has this legal right gone? And the question that then goes into what will happen to the Ukrainian unity if there are threats to democracy and the rule by the people. There are no strengthened boundaries. Okay. Thank you. We remember the question. We have 2 more questions, and we'll come back to the room. Professor Walkowicz. A question in English, if you need translation, please put on the...
First of all, thank you very much for the comments. I found them extremely helpful and quite insightful. I just want to return to the question of the seminar, and that's in good part, how can historians actually think about writing the history of the crisis, and what can we add from our past? It seems to me many things, but many of them are not answers. They're just questions that come from new modes of historical research. Very productive work that's being done on what we call borderlands studies, for instance, which mean to suggest and address not simply conflicts over borders, but the fact that borders, as we have seen, are very porous. And as has been suggested, there tend to be political boundaries. There are cultural boundaries, of course, as well, but as anyone who remembers in the United States, we had something called the Cultural Wars that suggest culture can become a reductio ad absurdum in this. We have to be careful. There are, in fact, nations, and I think the more useful way of thinking about culture in this context is to ask who is in the nation, not simply to evoke the people, but to ask who are the people, who is at least imagined to be the people and the nation, and how has it changed. So there seem to me, I would just suggest 5 points that come from historical work. By the way, should add all historians, no historian is objective. We strive to be objective, and we hold ourselves accountable for being objective. We acknowledge that we come from different places, but we don't go about simply lying or extolling our politics. We seem to hold ourselves responsible for the evidence that we provide for an argument that we make. First of all, point that's been made, these events are historically contingent. They matter differently today than they would have earlier, and that, in that sense, I would be careful about simply invoking images of the Soviet Union or of the Ukrainian state as if they've been unchanging. So Putin is a very particular kind of Soviet agent. It isn't clear that you would have had the same thing under Yeltsin or under Gorbachev or at different modes of the states can change. I'm always a little wary about simply presuming the state is unchanging. It's a very particular kind of moment in the state that one wants to address. And that's, of course, true in the Ukrainian state as well. We talk about nations, but nations are invented, as has been pointed out. And the Ukrainian nation has been invented. It's a 20th century invention, largely. That doesn't mean the people who live here are invented, they had a sense, but there are many different kinds of people who inhabited these spaces, who have different relationships to other people in these areas. I'm curious, one of the major mode in historical writing in the more recent period has not been about the nation. Nationalism is, after all, a problem of writing about the nation. It's actually been the transnational. It would be interesting to hear and think a little bit about how transnational studies might in fact open up our study of this national moment, because after all there are lots of foreign players in the story. The nation is invented, and that brings me to who are the people. It's been suggested that ethnicity is not a part of the nation. I would soundly reject that notion. I don't think that can be sustained, especially in the context here. Some people are purged from the nation. Some people are remembered by the nation. Some people are idealized in the nation. And they often have to do with their different and distinct backgrounds. So we have to open archives for sure. But it seems to me some of the most productive work of the more modern period has been work on the relationship between three elements that it seems to me historians can use wisely in thinking about the present. The relationship between history, memory, and identity. Who gets remembered, who gets forgotten, and who gets identified, and how. My grandfather came from Ushtika, as you know, a town west of Lviv. He imagined himself as Polish. He spoke Yiddish and Polish. Other grandparents lived in the area outside of Warsaw. On the census, they described themselves sometimes as Polish, sometimes as Russian. Of course, both were true. It was the Congress of Poland. It was controlled by Russia. And the census is wholly unreliable because it's a social construction as well, by census makers as to what the categories are and they aren't. What historians can do and have done is be able to construct and deconstruct those categories. Who's involved in telling the story? How is the story being told? Who gets to tell the story? In that regard, this morning, in my hotel room, having arrived, I downloaded a map of Lviv that included a discussion of all the main historical sites to visit. And there were about 30 different sites. And not one would have suggested that Jews ever lived in Lviv. This is a problem as to who gets remembered and who's a part of the past and of the present. And that's equally true, it seems to me, in all the different parts of Ukraine today. Of course, there are differences. Of course, there are regional differences. There are in all of these countries, like in the North and the South in the United States. Of course, there are regional differences. One can decide how to honor them or not honor them, or at the same time to talk about who is the state and who has power to make that state. But I would argue quite central to the project for us, for people here, as much as it is in every other part of the world right now, is to be able to reconstruct as historians both the past and the present, and to think about who's getting to tell that story, how it's being told, what's being left out, who's being privileged in that account, and who's not being privileged in that account. I thank the three of you for having opened up those questions brilliantly.
Thank you very much, and please pass the microphone to your neighbor. I have a short comment. This thought about the fact that, to a certain extent, the non-existence of borders in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the non-existence of borders in Europe coincide. But at the same time, I disagree that in the east of Ukraine, they borrowed it from the European model. Because the European model, this European model of blurring borders and boundaries stems from protected identity. While in eastern Ukraine, the model was completely different. This is the model that has deep roots. And this is the model of blurring identities, forceful blurring of identities for the sake of one single Soviet identity that was imposed upon everyone. So I think the situations are completely different. It's like before the modern times and after the modern times. So there are some commonalities there, of course, but the profound causes are completely different. So dear participants, you've heard 3 different questions, 3 different comments. Now I want you to respond. I've noted that there's something similar between all the comments and questions that we have just heard, which is the desire to find a path from the traditional narrative, nation-focused narrative, to the focus on local communities. And I think that this focus on local communities would be of great interest, not only from the viewpoint of historians that specialize in microhistory. And I think it would be great if we paid more attention to microhistory, because in this microhistory you can find more interesting information about the individual role of communities than about disruption of ties and links. And on the other hand, we have transnational narratives that describe the history of interstate, intergovernmental influences. And I don't think that we apply this narrative to the Ukrainian case the way we should. So the notion of nation that often has the notion of ethnic nation behind it, in the times of post-2 revolutions on the Maidan, has acquired a new meaning. But I think that this notion is still not well reflected in the modern science. And another important thing is that we have lost Drahomanov's tradition. I think you remember that Drahomanov fought for national values, but he also put forward the federal ideal, and it's also a methodological approach to the understanding of the notion people or nation, because through the federal model you can give more rights to the local communities, but at the same time you can emphasize that the research of humankind in general does not have to be related to the research of specific nations, because the research of nations is referred to the late 19th, early 20th century. Basically, this is the period of our history that led to World War I and then World War II. So the current awareness coincided with the awareness that local communities should have more rights, and that there should be more focus not on a human being, but more on human rights. But it's a big problem, and I would be interested in hearing the opinions of my colleagues sitting here.
Yes, just 2 things. As far as transnational history is concerned, yes, I think it's a very interesting and important approach, and I think it is being adopted by many Ukrainian historians. There are some books already written. I think Kasyanov and others published collection of essays. So yes, it is being adopted, and I'm sure it will contribute to the development of Ukrainian studies, Ukrainian, Polish, Russian studies. As far as memory, identity, and you mentioned 3, I forgot the memory.
History memory.
History memory, yes. Of course, these are terribly important, and in fact, all these things are being incorporated, maybe a year or 2 years late, but yes, I think as far as I could tell, my Ukrainian colleagues are very sensitive to what is being done in the United States, in Europe, and so on. But I did mention the question of archives and secrecy. The extent of secrecy that existed in this country until recently, and in Russia, in the Soviet Union, is beyond our imagination. In other words, that's my conviction. And this helped me to understand because I worked in Soviet secret police archives, and then Polish archives, Japanese archives, and then Chinese documents. I've looked at, last week I was in Mongolia, because I cannot access to these documents in Russia, so I go to those peripheral countries and see what, just extraordinary. In other words, if we do have access to the classified documents in Moscow, I'm absolutely certain that the history of the 20th century will be rewritten. Now, what the Poles and the Ukrainians did in the last 5-10 years is extraordinary. Using SBU archives, using Polish IPN archives, we published like 15, 17 volumes. Extraordinary things. We got to know things we didn't know. Both Soviet Union and Moscow and Warsaw try to sort of do ethnic cleansing, exchange of ethnic Ukrainian and ethnic Poles through the borders. They may not be particularly significant, but there are many other things that Moscow simply doesn't want us to know. And if we know these things, we'll have to change our views of history. And that is exactly what Moscow wants us not to know. So that's why I'm repeatedly emphasizing that we cannot assume many things in Soviet history at face value, because simply Moscow hides so many important documents.
To be honest, I'm not sure that we lost our communities in regions, and that there are some problems with these internal borders. It just happened so that in the Soviet times, it was not compulsory in the times of Ukrainian independence. It was more about business data. So I think that we have not lost anything. And if we raise this issue of local communities and what they should acquire, and the more rights that they should acquire, then it's all about positive thinking. But I'm a historian after all, and for me it's interesting to research some dotted borders or boundaries, and how these dotted lines can acquire a practical sense and practical meaning. So this is something that is interesting to me. And with regard to historians and the place of different memories and identities and identification of history, I think that it doesn't really matter what kind of conclusions we come to in this group. A historian is a very subjective personality, subjective figure. Historians will do things and will write history the way they see it, and it's up to the responsibility of these individual historians. And if historians do it in a quality manner, if they do it in an honest manner, then it will definitely shape the vision of this history. And some other historians will do the same thing. They will also express their subjective opinion. So that's the way I see it, because we cannot, we need to have some guidance on how to do that. We cannot just instruct historians how to write history, because then it will not be science, it will be more propaganda. But I think that nowadays historians on an intuitive level felt these points of pain that have to be filled with facts. So there are some gaps that need to be filled, and we need to fill them with facts first, and then with concepts.
We have Volodymyr Sklokin, we have Yaroslav Hrtsak, and a comment, and then a question over there. Sorry, I'm sorry to do this again, but this will be very brief. Right. Just a response to Serhiy. I disagree with him in that the free community of Dromana was criticized at the same time. It only envisaged the transformation of the Russian Empire, and it was recognized as utopia even in the late 19th century, and they never came back to it because you can't turn Russia into free communities. I disagree with the colleague who said that we don't have property. We have communal property, and everybody knows this. But I have a provocative question to all the historians. The western border of Ukraine was instituted through deportation, through population transfers. 480,000 Ukrainians and roughly 806,000 Poles were mutually transferred. Now we have a situation where 1.3 people transferred into Ukraine from the Donbass, and about 1.5 people moved to Russia. Can we tomorrow think, historians, can we tomorrow think of these things as deportations? I wanted to thank you for these very interesting thoughts and opinions, and this will be more of a comment because much has been said, but I was actually a little bit surprised because it was all kind of abstract. It had this, there seemed, so without a connection to our modern situation, so maybe I'd like to just make this connection with this specific war, with the Euromaidan and the Crimea annexation and the war in the Donbass. What does this mean to us as historians? First of all, what sort of conclusion can we draw? What conclusions, plural, can we draw? And it seems that the most important conclusion that I could make for myself from all of this is that this is even more... I had certain doubts, and I understood this, but this completely kind of undermined the kind of teleological understanding of the role of this territory. That is the basis of how history is written, at least a synthesis of the history of Ukraine, because you either look at the modern territory of Ukraine or the territory of ethnic Ukrainian lands that Serhiy mentioned, that as it was imagined by Ukrainian national activists, national figures of the 19th century, that sort of core, and then it's sort of projected into the past, and thus we have this history. Depending on how far back we can go, and however we write this history, whether we write a history of ethnic Ukrainians or we write a history of all the different nationalities, nevertheless this territory remains a kind of sacred cow. And I don't know a single, until recently, I can't think of a single, this was mentioned, but I've never seen an attempt to write a history different than based on the territorial synthesis of the history of Ukraine. And what happened with Crimea, what is happening in the Donbass now, in my opinion, it's this kind of ultimate response of history itself, saying that there is no teleology, everything is subject to change. And from a scholarly point of view, all the more, this has no basis to project it into the 9th century or to the 4th century BC, the territory of Ukraine, of today's Ukraine, and write this history of Ukraine in this way. This is the first concept, idea, which is important, which of course means that, which of course tells us how now to write or not to write this history of Ukraine in the future. The second thing is, much has been said of the role of historians. This is a topic that interests me greatly, that I've been studying for a long time, and I cannot agree with either Leonid Zashkirnyak, that we've been arguing with for a while, who's already responded, that repeated today, that a historian identifies and legitimizes, and the third one, and sets examples, and he always speaks from a particular, as a representative of a particular community. Now, I think this approach is wrong, but that's what we see. This is what we see happening in this conflict, because historians, both from the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side, whoever, whether consciously or not, try to play these roles and legitimize the work of their states, or let's say how they see the missions of their states. So we're talking about a historical legitimization of this conflict. In Russia, this is on a political level, but also on a historical level. For instance, the history with Novorossiya, with New Russia. In Ukraine, too, we see in the past year, we see many publications on the Cossack, or the Ukrainian Donbass, Institute for National Memory has put a project on the Ukrainian Crimea. So there's this attempt historically to legitimize these territories, to say that they're Ukrainian. And although in Ukraine this is done more out of it's a scholarly proposition, nevertheless, essentially it's the same thing. And I think that this approach will not be useful either to our historical learning, nor will it help us regain these territories or tell the people who do not want to be part of Ukraine that they have to be Ukrainian, they have to come back to Ukraine. And I think this is where, very briefly, we can touch upon the role of the historian. We have to revise and look at the role of the historian in the situation in which we are as a critical role, as a role that undermines certain stereotypes and schemes. And the most important stereotype is what Serhiy mentioned. It's this essentialization of this nation, of this ethnicity and this culture as these kind of political arguments and these kind of historical categories. So this is what lets Putin claim certain parts of the territory of Ukraine today, and not just Ukraine. That this is like a cultural and ethnic or whatever, that this culturally and ethnically this belongs to Russia. And the role of historians would have to be to undermine this kind of thinking, especially of these ethnic categories and the demonstration of the kind of the constructed nature of these things, and thus to help build this political nation. Because it seems to me that the idea that, you know, in writing books on Ukrainian Donbass will convince those people that they have to come back or that Donbass has to be Ukrainian. No, I think in building some kind of it's in building a politically and economically stable Ukraine that we will convince them all the more, much better. And this way we can show them that this land is not necessarily ethnic, or you don't have to even speak Ukrainian to be Ukrainian. I think this is the better way, and I will end there. And if you could give the microphone to Yaroslav. We didn't collude with Volodymyr, but I will continue what he said, because I agree with his ethos. But I will just say that there's a question there are questions that are interesting, but there are questions that are important. And it seems that the point of the historian who has an agenda to try to differentiate between them. And I understand why we're talking about the Donbass, why we're talking about the border, and why we're talking about the nation, because this is the point of the moment. But I would like to look at the Ilya Gerasimov, the editor of the Up Imperio publication, said, look, the Ukrainian discussions of what happens are like the discussions of a victim of violence. Of a rape victim, a victim that was raped. What was I wearing? Maybe I shouldn't have walked down the street. Maybe the skirt I wore was too short. We're trying to look for internal problems for something happened. Gerasimov said, look, the analysis is very simple. It's FSB work from 2009 that they were writing about leaders of the DNR. This is work that was aimed at this scenario, and we're not discussing these issues. We think that these issues are not important. If we look at what happens from these points of view, that this was a project from FSB, that this in 2009 was already written, the scenario was already there, you can trace it down, you can show analytic notes that seemed too fantastical back then, nobody believed them, but they were there. So maybe the fact that Ukraine has survived the FSB project and that Ukraine has not fallen into this trap, that the new Russia project is over, that maybe this is what historians should discuss. But this is not even what I'm saying. This is just the preface to what I'm trying to say. Because look, we're just dealing in interesting questions right now. And now as to important questions. When we we're working on the Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation, it's not that we were just afraid of Russia. That wasn't the foremost in our mind. Of course we were afraid of Russia. The biggest fear was that if Poland enters the EU and Ukraine remains, this will be this very clear boundary where we've managed to reconcile and we didn't. And we decided we'll end up on our own for many, many years. And I don't know if I managed to formulate this well, but for me, the important question is not when Donbass will come back to Ukraine or how and what scenario this will follow. That's an interesting question. But the important question is what Ukraine will Donbass come back to in 3, 5, 10, whatever years. is it the same? Will it be the same Ukraine that existed in 2001 or in 2013, or will this be a Ukraine that will show a different possibility? The argument that I've heard many times that appeals to me, and that maybe reformulate a little bit. If we look only at the category of nation, identity, etc., we see the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. That's an interesting question, of course, but if we understand that in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, it's not just the Russian conflict, it's the future model of the world. It's a global question. This is one of those territories where this question is being resolved today. It's the question of the new world that started, let's say, on September 11th, 2001. It's the crisis of 2008. This is the world that we will live in. It's a very uncertain world. And these questions are the ones that we should be posing. And perhaps just to conclude, because we can talk very long. If we talk about identity, on nation, the borders, boundaries, historical memory, we recreate old discourses. We talk in the language of identity. We're not leaving this. Of course we're fighting Putin. Of course we're fighting Putin. But this will not let us propose a new agenda. This does not let us answer the question of what sort of Ukraine the Donbass will come back to. This will be a Ukraine that will continue to survive, a reasonably stable country, but a stagnating country with the same borders. And just to conclude, what is the agenda of a historian? Is to form a new agenda, to leave the discussions of the nation, identity, historical memory. These are interesting questions, very interesting, and there are many people who will write their dissertation on this, and let them. They should. But if we really want to be worthy of our great duty to be historians, let us form a new agenda of what we will be writing on. And there's a question here. Thank you. There's a question by the window there. Yes. This is really to continue the previous two replica comments. It's somewhat ideologically wrong, but it's harder for me because I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist, and I have to form the history taking place in the present, without the facts that historians can later take into account. So the question is, much has been said on the Maidan as something that is great and ideal and high, but we were talking about that we shouldn't idealize war because war is death and horror. We shouldn't idealize heroism because it's death. And then the question is, well, the Maidan as something that was a step in the direction of nation building, and another war, and today's war that is another step in that direction. This war will definitely not let you be inert. You have to take a side. Isn't there a certain double standard here that if we think, we think a bloody revolution to be ideal, but we condemn the war? Well, we have a number of questions and comments. I would like to ask our speakers on the board. To Serhiy, maybe you will start, as always. Well, I saw all of these different comments from my colleagues so resonated with me that I can't really add anything. Volodymyr and Yaroslav have clearly defined this agenda that I'm getting, but really what we understand is that, of course, history and identity can be a weapon, and this concept can be used as a weapon of aggression that is then taking place in actual fact, whatever we say of identity and culture. But as far as the Maidan is concerned, I meant a different thing. I'll try to explain. The fact that when the Institute for National Memory, with Shukhevich the Younger, make this list of heroes, and you start reading, and even professional historians don't know all of the heroes and who those heroes are, but it ends with the Heavenly 100. So the Heavenly 100 is not part of that row, because they're not talking about ethnic Ukrainianness and Ukrainian nationalism, but something completely different. And so the first one of them was not Ukrainian, and many of them were not Ukrainian. So is this a fight for? This is a fight for something else. And in my opinion, it's this. it's this dilution of this ethnic canon, and it's quite powerful because it's nearest to us chronologically, and the thing with it is if we interpret it in this democratic and humanistic spirit of this kind of civil patriotism, it will really subvert the hierarchies and canons that are being formed to replace the Soviet ones, but they will be as Soviet as the Soviet ones, just with a opposite sign.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments, for your questions. Regarding the first question, I would not rely on the figure 1.5 refugees in the Russian Federation, because I don't think that we can trust the statistics of the Russian Federation. I'm sure that this figure is much lower, and this is something that we will see later when we win. Well, is it deportation? Well, it's true indeed that it's a provocative question. As far as I am concerned, and this is my personal experience, I would call myself evacuated or internally displaced refugee, but I would not call it deportation. What would it be called by our neighbors? Well, let's see. I will not be surprised, considering the current condition, the current political condition in the Russian Federation, if it is called deportation, forceful deportation. But I think it's not up to us with the mental diseases of our neighbors. I would like to make some conclusions based on your comments and questions. In my opinion, it's very difficult to draw any specific conclusions. I have just one. I'm not well prepared to comment on the issues of evil and good, the philosophy of evil and good, because I can see that this is something that matters in the current situation, and this is something that should be incorporated in the discourse practices of the future Ukrainian agenda. I'm really sorry if I'm being harsh. People should come back to Ukraine, or they will come back to Ukraine if they read these or those books, and if they don't do that, they will not come back. If we think in these terms, or if Charles de Gaulle thought of Paris in those terms, in terms of books that should be read by the French to make them come back to France, I don't think he would have created the army of resistance, and he would not have won in the war. So I think that the occupied people are not information subjects. And if we shape our perception of people through the eyes of the Russian propaganda, and if we start thinking what we need to do, how we can make ourselves attractive for them not to leave or for them to come back, it will be wrong on our part. So, in my opinion, we often use the fought back territories. So basically we should not be talking about returning territories, but more about fighting these territories back. And by fighting back, I mean not only military means, but you can also use diplomatic means, economic means. You can offer some attractive agenda for these people, but it's still warfare, and you can only fight back these territories. Well, as for the Euromaidan, then it's just your position. Because for me, the Maidan was about shaping the political Maidan. I'm not idealizing the Euromaidan. At the same time, I'm not denying that the warfare, the current warfare, is just a continuation of this political nation building. Because a lot lot of voluntarily went to fight in eastern Ukraine. But we also have people on different sides of the front line. But at the same time, it does not refute the fact that our children should shape their own attitude towards warfare, and this should be attitude that it's hell, it's something terrifying. It does not mean that this is something that we should give to our children as heritage, that our children should inherit this positive perception of warfare.
You may not answer all the questions. Euromaidan. Yes, I think radical or radical die-hard nationalists played a very important role. There is no doubt. But many of these people groups were not elected after Euromaidan. Very similar to what happened to England after World War II. Church led the country to victory. When the war ended, the English people said, thank you. He wasn't elected. So, yes, when the passion was high, you fought. Fine, when that ended, well, the crisis, but then, of course, the sober mood came in. You had to think very hard exactly what kind of Ukraine you wanted. So that's one comment. And the other comment concerns Professor Rizak's comment. Yes, identities do matter, identities may not matter. What I could say is that, yes, there are many works published on the identities of the Donbass, for example, and we can add more, we can refine them. But as far as I could tell, none of these identities were incompatible with political independent Ukraine. So in that sense, I'm not quite sure identity studies really mattered. As far as I could tell, they accepted independent Ukraine. Within that, what kind of future they wanted to make. Yeah, some identities may not be particularly kind to Kiev, so what? But they still accepted independent Ukraine. So identity studies do matter, but sometimes don't matter.
Well, thank you very much to everyone indeed. I want to say thank you to all our speakers, to all the participants. They asked their questions, they made comments. A few conclusions to end our discussion. We know that history is the present past. And we also have the future past as a separate genre, because basically our future is something uncertain, something blurry and vague, and it shows us that there are no safe and secure places. And when we criticized the history of Ukraine as the history of the nation, territory was a safe place, was a place of refuge. But now we can see that the notion of territory is not this safe island anymore, is not something certain and secure. So it witnesses once again that it's essential to take into account the multiple character, the openness and adequacy and situational character of all these topics. By situational character, we do not mean temporary character. And going back to the issue of subjectivity, that was raised by one of the participants. And as a moderator, I would like to contribute to this discussion. The other side of subjectivity is responsibility. And we, as historians and as citizens and as human beings in the first place, should be learning this responsibility and should be learning to practice this responsibility. Thank you for being part of this discussion and wish you a nice evening.